All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, February 21st of 2022. It is President's Day here. We are cruising along through the NBA All-Star break. No NBA still here for 3 days this week. I am certainly very much starting to miss it here. Feels strange coming on to a Monday stream at this time of year, not having any NBA to talk about, but hopefully you had fun this weekend with the NBA All-Star events and, of course, the Daytona 500. We did a stream last week with Kingfish NATO from our community here. That's up now on our YouTube channel, walking through NASCAR DFS strategy and also in part unveiling our new NASCAR Sims, which are now live in the app. We had projections up for obviously the main event, the Daytona 500, but also the trucks and the Xfinity and the duels for this past week. I was building some of my first NASCAR DFS lineups this past weekend, had a lot of fun with it. I think it's, although the sweat is a little unpredictable, as we were talking about last week, it is certainly a fun game theory game. I think it's quite a bit fun to build lineups for NASCAR. So excited to keep doing that through the rest of this season. We do have a few questions here in our queue here for today. We'll have an opportunity to do a couple research builds on the NASCAR side. We'll talk a little bit about, let's see, what do we have here? A couple questions about research builds, couple questions about, optimizing for top 1% outcomes here. So only 3 questions in my queue here today. So if you have any questions for me, go ahead, pop them into the YouTube chat, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we'll go ahead and start getting into it. So we've got our projections up from Daytona here. I thought it'd be fun to play with the NASCAR Sims a little bit here. And we'll start with a good question from GEN here. So let's see. The question says, happy Monday. Have a quick question regarding NBA or NASCAR research builds. For example, you do the 0010 build, and there are players with X number of exposures versus when I do my, wait a minute. Okay, before I do my final build before the contest, and let's say there are 3 to 5 players that aren't in my final build with 0 exposures to them. Let's say I want those players in my build. Should I add them, or should I trust the build and leave those players out? So let's do this. Let's run the NASCAR settings as they are set right now are basically just set at using single race simulations to build lineups. So they are essentially set at the research build settings. And that makes it pretty easy for us to play with this. So let's take a look at this. I think this is a really good question. It kind of gets at the core of the research build, right? The question, as I'm understanding it here, is if you are doing your research build and you can see that there is a positive leverage opportunity, right? There is a player that maybe is going to be owned lower than their chance to show up in the optimal lineup, but then you do your final build and they're not showing up in your builds. Should you go in and add them? So let's see if we can find a guy like that first off, and I might be able to find one here. I mean, honestly, I don't want to come at this with like some unnecessary hindsight, but a couple of the names that are popping up here, right, from Daytona, Keselowski, Bubba Wallace, Austin Cindric, right? Interesting names here to see, right? They are guys that started, I guess, with the exception of Bubba, in the top 10. Racers that would not have been projected very well for this particular race. They come in at low ownership because they're starting at the front, right? And the builder's saying there's like a positive leverage opportunity here, right? The field with these simulations, with these ownership projections, is going to inefficiently roster these racers by about 5%. They're about 5% more likely to show up in the optimal lineup than their ownership would indicate. Let me change these projections here so we can actually see some lineups. But then let's go ahead and look and say here, right, that let's say we're playing 150, right? And when we actually get to here, actually, let's say we're playing like 20, right? Let's cut this down even more. Now we have no Keselowski, right? We have a couple Bubba Wallace lineups. We have no Cindric, right? So the question is like, what do I do now? My research build said that the field is going to inefficiently roster these racers, but I'm getting none of them in my top 20 or so lineups or something like that, right? Well, this is kind of where it gets interesting. And I think the main sticking points, or the main reasons I think the research builds are valuable, is to find these kinds of plays, or the opposite of these kinds of plays. So you have the plays where they're not going to be projected well. The field is going to roster too little of them relative to their chance to be optimal, or they are projected well, right? But the field is going to roster too many of these particular players, right? Those are the plays where I think the research build gets very interesting. And then where the research build gets interesting when you're doing this is the plays that are obviously the good projected plays, but maybe you want to temper exposure to them, and the plays that maybe are not well projected plays, but you want to get some exposure to them. I mean, on a practical level, right? I think it's perfectly fine to... Sorry, I got distracted there for a second. I think it's perfectly fine to add in some exposure to these plays, right? I think if you determine that there's inefficient ownership to a particular player or driver or whatever, depending on the sport, based on your research build, you can add in some exposure here. And I think a good way to do it is to do it based on that ownership projection, right? Like, we don't need to get positive leverage on a field that we think is being inefficiently rostered, right? On a guy like Cindric, I mean, I think he actually was like 3 to 5% owned. It might be enough to just get 10% exposure to him, right? And I mean, it's very easy for the builder to get it there. So I think you can kind of get an appropriate amount of exposure to some of these drivers or players in a different sport or whatever, right? Based on their projected ownership that's showing up, right? Same deal here. Let's do the reverse option of this. So, right, let me come back here. Hang on. So according to our research build, some of the most over-owned racers in this race would have been Almirola and Austin Dillon, right? Also, two of the best overall projected drivers in the event, right? So how do we take advantage of that? Well, maybe one way to do that, even in your pool of 20, would have been to, rather than removing them completely, maybe we cap our exposure, right? And we limit our exposure to two drivers that we think the field is slightly overexposed to, right? I think the one other thing to consider here is that this is somewhat contest dependent, right? And especially as I don't like to do this as much for NBA. I've talked about that a little bit here before, but something especially for like NBA, the need necessarily to roster a player that shows up as a positive leverage opportunity, but still only has, say, a raw 5% or 10% chance of showing up in the optimal lineup anyway, might not be a player that you need to get exposure to if you're playing a small single entry tournament, right? So let's run a build. Let's run a research build for Thursday's NBA slate, which I was happy to see we had projections for this morning. And I'll give kind of an example of what I mean. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to this particular question of should I go and force exposure to the players that I determined were good positive leverage plays in my research build that aren't showing up in my actual build at all, right? It depends, I think, one, on what is the raw percent chance of that player showing up in the optimal lineup, period, right? How much risk do you want to take on with this player, right? There could be a player hypothetically that's, let's say they're going to be rostered at their projected ownership is 1%, and they have a 5% chance of showing up in the optimal according to the research build, right? That is essentially 5x leverage. The field is 5 times wrong on that, but they still only have a 5% raw chance of getting there. And determining if you want to play that angle is going to depend a lot on the contest you're playing, right? And how much risk you need to assume to give yourself a shot at having an optimal lineup, or how much risk you need to assume to have a shot at placing top 1% in the contest. So let's look at this here. I guess actually like a pretty good example here is, again, this is very early in the week. We're talking about a Thursday NBA slate. But hypothetically, right, this is saying that, the field is equally inefficient rostering both Seth Curry and Al Horford. But Seth Curry has twice the raw percent chance of showing up in the optimal lineup. So if you were running your build for a contest, right, let's say, maybe a 20 max or something, or even a single entry, and you were trying to figure out how do I want to get my leverage on the slate? Or actually even, better yet, let's just use Ayton and Derek White, right? Two players that are both going to be inefficiently rostered according to these ownership projections and these simulations, right? Inefficiently but the field is inefficient on their ownership of both these players by about 9%. And actually even Jay Crowder gets kind of thrown in there too, or Wiggins. Like all of these guys are here together. But there's still a spectrum of how likely those players are to show up in the optimal lineup period, right? I would argue that at this particular point, the safest positive leverage play is DeAndre Ayton. If I was running a build now, right? So let me write down these 4 names here so I don't forget them. So we have Ayton, White, Crowder, and Wiggins, right? Those are kind of our top overall best leverage plays, right? And actually, let's do it on the negative side as well here. So the most negative leverage plays are Edwards, Beverly, and Ellaby. Let's just keep them, right? Okay, so now let's run a actual test build. So that's our research process, right? Now let's run a test build. And let's say we're playing a contest 20 max or something like that. So I think what's important here is on the NBA side, right, when we're actually running the build for our actual lineups, the sim variance slider is coming down. We're going to get less exposure to some of those not as well projected plays that showed up as positive leverage opportunities in our research build, right? So now let's look. So Ayton. So we're getting exposure to Ayton. That's great. Derek White, we're about even with the field here, right? Okay, so we're getting some exposure to Crowder. And actually, we're getting exposure to Wiggins. So in this particular case, we're actually getting exposure to all of the plays that we identified as good positive leverage plays. But are we getting any exposure to, well, even Seth Curry showing up here? So maybe this isn't as good of an example because I guess this is a good example, right? We identified as Al Horford as maybe a top 10 overall positive leverage play, but he's not projected that well. He's only, 0.8% owned, right? In this particular case, do we need to go out and get exposure to this player? That's where I think there's going to be some personal kind of risk tolerance question here of do you need to assume this much risk, right? Or do you need to get leverage in this amount in this particular way? And I think a lot of that is going to depend a lot on the particular contest you're playing. The top heavier the contest is, the more lineups that are in the contest period, the more I would say it makes sense to assume a little bit more risk to get those positive leverage plays into your lineup, right? But I think the crux of this here is that the most interesting players that it comes down to when you're doing your research build are going to be the players that aren't projected very well on average, that there's an inefficiency on the ownership because the field is under-owning those plays, and the players that are projected very well on average, and the field is inefficiently over-owning them. So, kind of a tricky question, GEM. Let me know if that helps clear that up a little bit. Again, I know there's not really a hard and fast rule here strategically. I think you kind of have to handle this a little bit on a player-by-player basis, a slate-by-slate basis. I would say in general, the higher variance the sport, the bigger the contest I'm playing, the more top-heavy the payout structure of the contest is, the more willing I am to force some of these my exposure editing in on players that I think either the field is inefficiently over-owning or inefficiently under-owning is kind of, I guess, the short answer there. But good question. Yeah, good stuff. Okay, let's see here. Cool. We go to this next question here. This one is from Brendan here, also kind of on the research build side of things here. And he said, Jordan and company, would you please explain what settings would be most analogous to an NBA 0010 research build as applied to SaberSim MMA? This one is kind of a little bit unique at the moment just because of the way that the MMA builder is working. In theory, it would still just be a 0010 build, right? Or not a 0010. In this case, there's only 2 sliders, no correlation slider. In theory here, this would just be a 010 build. At the moment, the MMA builder is not directly plugged into simulations as the same as other sports. The MMA builder is building as if it were more of a typical optimizer. So rather than rather than this smart randomness slider being a measure of how big you want your sim bucket to be for each lineup, it is just a more true kind of normal distribution based randomness slider like you may have seen in other optimizers. Now that we are aware that that is a limitation of the MMA builder, it is in our roadmap, I would say, for the next couple months conservatively to get this plugged in and use the simulations to build MMA lineups. For now, I do think using a 0-10 build for MMA still does a pretty good job of approximating the percent chance of a fighter to be optimal, but it is not something I would not be as confident in it as I would be for other sports, right? I think I'm actually kind of curious to see how this shakes out here. Let's run this and see what it looks like. The main reason why, I guess, while this is building, I'll kind of like MMA is going to have very binary results, right? Where an average projection is not a very good tool to use to build lineups. So using a normal distribution randomness curve is also not going to be, like, assuming that each fighter has a very wide bell curve around their average outcome is also not going to be a very good approach for researching and determining how likely a fighter is to be optimal. But I do think it can still be a decent way to approximate it, or at least give you something meaningful to work with. Determining which fighters are maybe going to be most over-owned and which fighters are going to be most under-owned is something I think you can still use a research build for. And I'm kind of just curious to see what these exposures look like here. But let's see here. We'll let this build finish. Might as well get it all the way to 1,500 here. And actually, never mind. Let's see here. So again, I think this can still be a useful tool. And I think especially for figuring out how you want to leverage against the field, using the 0-10 sliders will work, but they will get better. It will become a sharper tool for research when we get it plugged into the Sims. So, okay, cool. Let's keep going. Question from Tone930 here in Slack. And he said, I was watching a previous stream and you mentioned something about how the best players optimize for the 1% outcome. Do you mean they adjust their projections for that? I know the danger of using ceiling projections is you may get a lot of lineups with too many low salary guys, but do you think in theory it could be effectively done provided the min and max exposures are strictly outlined before a build? Thanks in advance for the response. By the way, really boring with no NBA. The All-Star break is too long. Yeah. Ryan mentioned too, NBA withdrawal is real. It certainly is. Missing it today here. Cool. Let's go ahead. Let's bump back over to NBA. I was looking at this question as it came in this morning, and I was trying to find, I remember what you're talking about. I was trying to find the exact stream where I said it, and I couldn't find that. I couldn't find the exact context of when I said this. What I really meant here, I think, is less about optimizing for the 1% outcome for individual players, right? Not so much about saying, just build using the 99th percentile for all players, like that kind of optimization. I meant more optimizing lineups that have a greater than their fair shot of finishing at the 1% of the contest you are playing in. And that is what I think skilled DFS players do and what good DFS lineups look like. And the reality is that's actually, that's kind of that's basically what we are trying to do with the SaberSim builder, right? Is really what this is talking about. Is the weakness of average projections, right? We don't really have a financial reason to care about the average projections because average results do not win GPPs, right? The money in GPPs is in the top 1%. Well, how do we get there? Well, instead of looking at an average of what can happen across every single simulation, right? Let's look at smaller buckets of potential outcomes on a per lineup basis. with the size of those outcomes being relative to how many other lineups we need to beat, right? That's essentially what the sim variance slider is. The bigger your contest, the smaller the number of outcomes we're looking at for each individual lineup, because we need to beat more and more lineups that exist to potentially optimize for other outcomes, right? We need to think about ownership, because we're not just trying to make the highest overall top scoring lineup possible. We are trying to beat other lineups. There's a more relative advantage to having players in our lineups that other lineups in the contest don't roster, right? We care about correlation, less so in a sport like NBA, but in other sports, NHL, MLB, football, right? Because we can get a lineup that has a greater percent chance of having an upside outcome by playing players that are likely to succeed together, right? I mean, the one thing about, especially on the correlation side, I think the easiest thing to think about here is that players that are positively correlated together are also likely to fail together, right? But we don't care about that because we're optimizing purely for the top end outcome. So, I mean, when you're thinking about this, I don't know if there's necessarily a huge practical impact of this. I especially when I was originally mentioning this, I don't know if there's something that, I don't know if there's something so much that I would just do when building lineups to think about this, because a lot of this is already kind of optimized for you. But my point is more to think less about average projections and think less about what players have a chance to succeed or do well, and more of what are the characteristics of a lineup that has a top 1% outcome, right? What are the lineups that have paths to finishing in the top 1% of a contest full of other lineups, right? I think that's kind of the lesson here. And if I remember correctly, the question here, the context of the question was about, the difference between picking players and building lineups, right? So, but good question. Let's see. Question from a meme here. How smart is the ownership adjustment setting relative to efficient ownership? Does it vary based on slate, contest, and sport? Interesting. I assume we're talking about the ownership fade slider here. So, I mean, the ownership fade slider is smart in that it is set to where it is based on, yes, the sport and also the slate size, right? Like our sizing of the ownership fade slider is relative to the sport and the contest you are telling us you are playing, right? We are valuing ownership more in a larger field contest, right? We are valuing it less in a smaller field contest, right? The relative edge we need to gain on the field via ownership is smaller when there are less lineups overall in the contest. It is smart, using that same kind of word here, in one other way that's, I would say, consistent across different contests and sports, in that it is the ownership fade slider is plugged into the overall variance of a particular player, right? So I think this is easiest to see in sports. I think the actual best example of this is baseball, which I know off season for that right now. But if we go and look at baseball here, right? Pick a random slate here. There's a significant difference in the variance of a hitter and a pitcher, right? And we can just see that basically, looking at the pretty much any distribution for a particular player, right? So we have the distributions of a hitter versus the distributions of a particular pitcher, right? Pitchers are generally a little bit more normally distributed, right, than the hitters are. Hitters are basically completely not normally distributed. There is less variance to a pitcher's range of outcomes around that average projection. The ownership fade slider will pick up on that. When we are basically drawing the bucket of simulations for a particular player and then adjusting based on the ownership for the ownership fade slider, we will fade players that have a higher variance more, even if they had the exact same ownership projection than a lower variance player with the same ownership projection, right? So it is smart in that way as well. So there's kind of, I guess, a couple different factors there. Is that the actual sizing of the ownership fade slider is adjusted on a per sport, per slate size, per contest basis. But the actual calculation there also is kind of smart enough to pick up on the variance of a player. So let me know if that helps. Okay, cool. B-Swifty said, jumping over to YouTube chat here. NASCAR was definitely different, Lowell. I think I will be just sticking with my other sports. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun building lineups. I like these sports that play a little bit, I like higher variance sports that there's a little bit more of kind of a game theory angle. I also think too that it's just been refreshing after this point in the NBA season, having some sports where there's no late swap and you can kind of spend that time doing a little bit more research, playing a game theory angle, because you don't have to adjust or throw some of that out the window halfway through the slate. Like I spent a lot of time on my NASCAR lineups, doing kind of research build kind of things and figuring out exactly where optimal ownership was for some of these different racers. I think I ended up having like a slightly down race, which is totally fine. But I had a lot of fun putting the lineups together. So I am excited for this weekend already. Slim Shady said, don't want to sidetrack you with unimportant related DFS issues, but where and how can I get a SaberSim shirt, hat, or other gear? We don't have a shop. We give out SaberSim swag as a reward for our winner circle. So if you wear the SaberSim logo as your DraftKings or FanDuel avatar and then finish top 5 in a GPP for more than $1,000, we will send you some gear based on how big of a win it is. So I think at the $1,000 prize point, you get the t-shirt, and then at the 10K plus, you get the hoodie, I think. Oh, and you get the hat. So there you go. Let's see. I know I mentioned this one earlier. Ryan said NBA withdrawals way out. At least we get a Cameron Payne revenge game to start the NBA DFS season. Yeah, do we? It looked like he was projecting pretty well here. If our ownership projections are correct, it seems like there will be at least a handful of people playing the Cameron Payne revenge game angle. Oh yeah, Chris Paul's out. That's right. So cool. Looking forward to it. Dante said, hey, Jordan, in NBA, if I'm low on a player from research, is it better to just lower his projection or remove him completely from the pool? Trying to tune that part of my process. I personally like to stay away from more extreme, I like to stay away from more extreme measures like removing players from the pool completely, just because I like to have the opportunity to kind of check my work. If you remove a player from your pool, that's it. He's not going to show up in any of your lineups. So let's go back to this, right? This is the build we ran here after our research build. And a couple of the players that we had picked up on as negative leverage opportunities were Edwards, who's not in our pool at all, Beverly, who we have 30% of, and Ellaby, who we have 35% of. And I think it's perfectly fine, even if you came in here to just say, I want to play really aggressive on the slate, and I'm going to go in and fade these 3 guys that I think are all negative leverage based on my research, right? Nothing wrong with doing this, but I like to have the ability to see how things fell in the build first, right? Maybe it might be enough to say, we're not getting any Edwards, right? That gives us enough negative leverage on the slate to be more comfortable just matching the field on Beverly and Ellaby, right? But if you remove them, or even we could come in here and say, just match the field. If you remove them in step 1, you don't really get another shot at that. They're just gone. So if you, I guess, being completely thorough here, if you had decided that no matter what, you were uninterested in playing these guys, you were going to 100% put their exposure at 0. At that point, it probably makes sense to just remove them from your player pool completely, so that your pool of 500 or 1,500 lineups or however many you have is actually better representative of how you want to do it. But for me in particular, I don't like to take as extreme measures of crossing players completely out of my pool based on my research build process. And again, it's kind of a fluid thing. I've talked about this in some of my NFL videos and my baseball videos, right? I will do my research build. I will take some notes about, where I want to find some leverage, how I want to approach the slate, but nothing's really set in stone for me until I get to the final build of building my lineups. And I like to have all of these guys still showing up in the pool just in case, maybe there's a different angle of how I want to play things once I get to that point. So. Kyle said, just rolling with the sim on NHL until NBA comes back. Yeah, that's essentially, I played some NHL today here. I haven't had a chance to play too much hockey this week, really, with the All-Star break going on. I've been a little busy, but I played today. We'll probably play some of these other slates through the end of the week while we wait for NBA. So. Okay, cool. So a couple of other questions here. This one is related to what we were just talking about. So I'll grab this one. This is from Brendan here. He said, why did removing one player make you more interested in the other two? Good question. I wouldn't say I became more interested in Beverly and Ellaby here in this case because Edwards is faded, right? I'm not more interested in those players, right? But in a sport so in NBA, lower variance sport, right? In this hypothetical example, maybe I'm playing like the and one or the quarter jukebox or 20 max or something like that, right? Where I'm not shooting for necessarily the absolute highest outcome. It might be that I'm getting enough leverage on the field, right? Hold on. I am getting enough leverage on the field with a full fade of Anthony Edwards, right? Who projects to be basically our highest leverage play, that I don't need to get additional leverage by fading these two other guys that showed up in my research build either, right? And maybe you do. If I was playing a bigger contest here, right? Maybe if there was a bigger overall contest, I wanted to get a little bit of more leverage, right? Then maybe I do cross these guys out. But this is typically how I kind of approach how I will typically, and again, I think NBA is a bad example because I feel like it's a little misleading talking about this for NBA because I don't actually do this that much for NBA, right? I don't do the research build thing as much, but in general, what my goal is, I will do a research build. I will kind of come up with my list of players that I think are interesting positive leverage plays or interesting negative leverage fades, right? And rather than coming into the actual build and saying, I need to get leverage on every single one of these players, I'm going to see how this actual build works out and kind of figure out how it fits together. And in this particular case, I may not need to make an aggressive stand on Pat Beverly and CJ Ellaby because I'm already completely fading Anthony Edwards. That's the idea there. And the higher variance the sport is, the bigger the contest I'm playing, the top heavier the payout structure is, the more I am going to try to find every leverage opportunity I can and optimize for that. But in this particular case, maybe it's enough of a fade. It's a big enough stand to just fully fade Anthony Edwards that I don't need to fade these other two guys. I also think, and this is something that was kind of in the back of my mind here, is that I would expect that these two guys have a negative correlation. Okay, smaller than I thought. I think there's also a side of it where if I'm already taking a really aggressive stand on Anthony Edwards, Patrick Beverly might be a player that stands to benefit in the event that Edwards fails to hit his ceiling outcome. But it doesn't look like they're as negatively correlated as I might have expected here. Again, I don't think correlations in NBA are huge. When I see correlations getting up to like negative 0.1, I think they're at least somewhat interesting to think about. But that was the reasoning there, is that, potentially we don't need to fade every player that we got a negative leverage on in our research build. So, cool. Okay, let's see. Another question from Tone here. And he said, thanks for the answer. I think I also heard you mention previously that as a rule of thumb, you sometimes look at for NBAs, you want guys that have the ability to hit 10x value, which for a 3,000 player is 30 points. Do you use the 99th percentile outcome for that? If a guy doesn't hit 10x at the top 99th percentile outcome, you don't play them, or is it based off a lower percentile outcome like the 95th or 85th? Yeah, so this isn't so much for me about the raw ability to score 10x, right? If Jokic is 12-5, right, he's virtually never going to have. Oh, I don't want to say never, because Jokic is a special player, but he probably has no real potential to hit 10x, right? For me, what it is it's more of an opportunity cost of a roster position, right? I want to make sure that any player I'm going to use a roster spot on, unadjusted for salary, has the potential to score enough fantasy points to make it worth their while in that spot. Where that number is for me is about 30 fantasy points, which happens to be 10x of the min salary available on DraftKings, which is 3,000. I do that a lot with the 95th percentile, right? I think the 99th percentile, when you're talking about that level of ceiling outcome, right? We are past or approaching 3 standard deviations away from the mean for a normally distributed player at that point. It's just a pretty extreme outcome. I like the 95th percentile as a way of kind of doing that, right? So on a practical level of how I'll actually do this, most of the time I will go in and kind of get an idea of what are the lowest projected players that have a 5% chance of scoring at least 30% or 30 fantasy points, and figuring out where that number is at the average. And it's not an exact science, but it maybe around 17 or 18 points for this particular slate. And then what I will do, just to make it easier on me, is I will just adjust my player filter for that. So I used to, and I know there's some of my old videos on YouTube. You'll see me actually going through here and checking each player that I don't want out of my pool. Ever since we added this player filter, I feel like it's just easier to do on the average. So this is something I will typically do almost every single NBA slate, is I will go in and I'll kind of figure out where that line is of that last player that I'm willing to see in my lineups is. Another way I sometimes do that is by the value column, is I will look and I'll kind of see what is the lowest projected player that has a point per dollar value of something that I'm kind of comfortable rostering. And a lot of times it ends up being around, for typical NBA slate, around 17 to 20 points, right? So I end up just ticking this up just a tad. But again, that's not so much about a player having 10x value or anything like that. It is just, once the slate locks, the salaries don't really matter anymore. And any player you rostered needs to be able to, it's not about them hitting 6x value, right? Or 7x value. It's about them earning their position in a lineup and scoring enough raw fantasy points that the rest of the lineup has upside. And I think that happens around, I don't know, roughly at least 30 fantasy points for a min salary player. So cool. All right, let's get to this question here. Question says, when late swapping, does it make sense to adjust the sliders to match what SaberSim would organically do for a smaller slate? For example, if it's a 7-game slate and there are 3 games left at the swap time, do you think it makes sense to adjust the sliders to match what SaberSim would have for the default if a 3-game NBA slate, since there are less available players to mix and match from? Or is it best to just leave the late swap sliders at the default for the 7 p.m. slate? I wouldn't adjust, right? What you would be doing is you would essentially be slowly throughout the night increasing your ownership fade and sim variance sliders, which I don't think is generally necessary. At the end of the day, you're still playing a 7-game slate in this particular case, right? You're still the lineups that you're building are still built from players playing in 7 different NBA games. I think I am almost more encouraged in general to bring my sliders down a little bit throughout the slate, mostly because I think, especially when there's big news that breaks throughout an NBA slate, if you know that the field, or if you can guess that the field isn't going to swap optimally for that news, it is really in your favor to worry less about ownership fade overall, worry less about variance overall, and just get some of the best projected plays into your lineup. Right? Let's say we're like hypothetically playing this slate here, and Is there anybody questionable playing in these later games here? Kind of, I guess. Okay, let's say we're playing this slate. It's Thursday, right? We built our lineups at lock. And at the end, let's look at these games too. Iguodala. I'm looking for like a big name player that's questionable. Not really. So let's just say hypothetically that as we're approaching the night games, let's say the Nuggets rule out. Let's just say they rule out Jokic, just for the hell of it, right? So now all of the Nuggets are spectacularly well projected plays. Well, if that had happened at lock, those players would be much higher owned. And in late swap, rarely do players get the ownership that they actually deserve when news breaks, right? There's just a portion of the field, especially at the lower stakes, that isn't going to swap optimally. And you can just get these plays now at an ownership discount. So I'm less concerned about looking for the highest variance outcomes. I'm less concerned about aggressively fading ownership. When that kind of situation happens, I'm inclined to bring these sliders down just to get as much exposure to these now very well projected plays as possible. So the only situation where I will late swap and actually turn my sliders up is if I'm having a very bad outcome with my lineups. If I'm winning back nothing as we approach like the night games or something like that, or overall it just feels like I'm having a floor outcome in my lineups, I will sometimes turn variance back up, turn ownership fade back up, and try to win back some min cash equity. But I think on average, most of the time, I just leave the sliders alone when I'm late swapping. So, but good questions. Any other questions for me here today? You guys put me on the spot here today with these. These are some good questions here. Definitely some ones that don't have necessarily a very clear, like, do this kind of answer with some of this stuff here. But any other questions here? Looking forward to the end of the week. We will most likely be doing another NASCAR stream. This time I'll be having maybe Matt or Will or some of the guys that worked on the model here for NASCAR coming on and talking about how our NASCAR sims actually work, what factors are included in that model, what the edge that we get out of using simulations are for NASCAR. So I think the goal is probably to have that closer to the end of the week, maybe Thursday or Friday. So look forward to that. We will be continuing to do the open Q&A office hours through the other days this week while we all wait for NBA to come back. So I don't see... Oh, okay, cool. We got a couple questions here from Edward here. Let's see. We'll just go ahead. We'll paste this in and we'll just read it here. All right. There's a lot on this one. Let's see. A few late stop questions. I played 4 types of contests last week on Thursday. A GPP single entry, a 20 max, a 150 max, and I played some cash contests. For the 20 max and 150, I used different min and max exposures on those 2 types of builds. And of those, the biggest exposure settings was that I wanted 50% min on Giannis and Luka. For the cash games, I used a different method to put my lineup in with no min max. So now the late swap questions. When I run my late swap builds, I use the different GPP late swap ones for single entry, 20 max, and 150 each late swap. Does the model use the last min max exposures by contest type? If no, how does it do that? Okay. My original lineup did not include Giannis, but after the first swap, let's see. After the first swap, the late swap put him in my lineup. Is that related to the min-max settings I used for my GPP lineups? Also, often when I late swap my cash lineups, I get the message that the build cannot meet my min and max exposure settings. I never use min and max for cash lineups. Why do I get that message? I understand why for GPP late swaps, but seldom get that for my GPPs. This is an interesting question here, and one that I might have to get back to you on. So I know that when you fill, I don't have anything entered for this slate, so I'm not going to be able to demo it. But when you fill your lineups into the entry editor, we pull the exposures in from the build that was used for that set of lineups. But if you're playing both cash and GPPs, I'm not entirely sure how that works. So I'm going to actually, Edward, I'm going to have to get back to you on this because I'm not so sure on exactly how that works. And I don't know. I'm curious if we track throughout the slate the difference between the exposures used for cash and GPP lineups. I'm going to have to get back to you on this one. That's a good question. So I think what it will probably take is I will just have to get entered for Thursday and then try to test this out a little bit. But okay, cool. Let's see. So I apologize for that, Edward, but I will get back to you on that. This question from Stanley: when I'm going back to practice my process in NBA, are the simulations based off the team roster at the date of the game? Just want to ensure it's not looking at the current rosters with new players. No, it should be good. So if we go back, or I guess yes, if we go back to like some early season stuff here. Oh, maybe that's not a good example. Let's go back to maybe just let's go to the Christmas Day slate. I was looking for a Nets game. I think they played on Christmas, right? Yeah. So you still got Harden as he was projected for the Nets on Christmas. So yeah, I believe the projections are kind of locked into their final values for whatever they were at the end of that particular slate after all news broke, and it won't change after that. So you should be able to go back and review and practice on past slates with the correct projections for what they were for that particular day. So, but good question. All right. What else we have? Any other questions for me here today? Don't see any others coming in here. I think we'll go ahead. We'll leave it there for today. Thank you to everybody that tuned in, that asked questions, that participated here today. Hope everyone's doing okay getting through the NBA break here. We will be right back again tomorrow, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions for me, maybe you're playing NHL today, maybe you're playing a little League of Legends DFS. I know LPL is going on early this week here. Pop your questions into the Office Hours channel in Slack. Shoot us an email, support@sabersim.com, or come join me live tomorrow and ask your questions in the YouTube chat. But until then, take care. Thanks. Good luck. See ya.